see from this meal, it's quite a feast. The table is set, and that's complete of celebrations in Ukraine, period. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. After this idea comes about, after Christianity settles in and these traditions get meshed, pagan and Christian, different forms start to develop. And this one in particular is truly Ukrainian. It doesn't really exist anywhere else in the Slavic world. It's called vertep, and it developed in the 1500s. And it's really this, it's like a living nativity, but it happens with puppets. And this word vertep, it refers to this idea of like a mystery cave or den. And so in the Orthodox tradition, it's this idea that Jesus was actually born in a cave, more like a cave than a manger, or what we think about like a small barn. And it's reenacted. And it's this allegory for the heavens, for God, for the cosmos and nature. So there's different characters that play different roles, but then they also would put in contemporary characters. So like politicians, like maybe the local, leader of the village, or during times when the Russians took over the area, they would make fun of the local, Russian landowner. And so it's this really interesting fusion. And at the same time, there was pressure both from the Polish-Lithuanian Confederacy and from Russia. And so a lot of what came out in these Christmas stories also was reflective of the politics of the time. And so this is 1,500 years ago. And so it's really interesting. And it doesn't really exist in the same way. It used to be a traveling nativity. So it was a large wooden box that had characters in it. It would go from town to town. They would have stories based on it. And what has happened, because it did sort of fall out of favor, and especially with Soviet times, almost went extinct, different theaters have brought it back, and it exists now more as a parade. And it goes along with a lot of caroling, but you still see the symbolism. And the puppets are really beautiful. So they reflect like a lot of Ukrainian embroidery, and then also they still reflect these classic Christmas characters. So this very much exists, and it's seen a resurgence, even though it is a little bit different than how it really started. And you can imagine it was a way to teach, right? Teach the young people these religious stories, especially in a time when a lot of people probably were not literate. And here's another scene. These are both in Lviv in Western Ukraine, which tends to be a little more Catholic than Orthodox. And because it's in the West, it also sort of escapes some of the influence of the Soviets. And so going there, it really does feel like a different place. And it's a lot of times referred to as sort of like a Ukrainian heartland, because a lot of traditions did keep going there, whereas they didn't in Kyiv and farther east. But yeah, just beautiful. And obviously the importance of the stars. Now, this is another tradition. This is more of an artifact, the Diduk. And so my friend Oksana, who I kind of went back and forth with some information, she's like, well, you have to tell them about the Ukrainian Christmas tree. And I would see on the sidewalk by the metro stations, there would be older women who had made these, and they would be selling them, and people would buy them. They'd bring them into their apartments. A lot of people live in apartments, especially in the big cities. They're not very big. A Christmas tree really isn't realistic. And it's really not a part of the tradition there. This is, and it can sit on a shelf. It can sit on top of a table. And it's a symbol of a lot of things. So it's obviously a symbol of Christmas. It's a symbol of the ancestors. So Diduk refers to grandfather, but it means more generally those who came before us. And it was traditionally either the first or last stalks of wheat. And you'll go, wherever you go in Ukraine, you'll see fields of wheat. And I'll show you, again, the visual importance of that if you don't know what the Ukrainian flag symbolizes. And the idea here is that you've got enough. You had enough, and you'll have enough next year. So we're getting through winter. We're going into another harvest. And even people who live in the cities, they typically would have a home, even during Soviet times, out in the countryside, so their dacha, and would have a garden. A lot of my friends that I worked with would bring in pickles of all kinds to give, or I would buy them from their parents or grandparents. And so being in touch with the harvest is a really important part of Ukrainian culture for the average person, I think a lot more than it is here. So something like this really symbolizes that, and it's a symbol of the season, and it's a symbol of also the religious beliefs. And a lot of times it's kept all the way until Lent. And then it's, again, like the straw that sometimes goes underneath the table. I'll talk a bit more about that. It gets burned as a symbol of the end, marking the end, and then a new beginning, right? So ashes to ashes. But they're beautiful and they're very simple. And I never really noticed the beauty of a stalk of wheat until seeing how it was used in Ukraine. And it's pretty amazing. And it speaks to the centrality of wheat in Ukrainian culture. As many of you know, it's the breadbasket of Europe. It's one of the top wheat producers in the world. And Ukrainians are very proud of this. They're very proud to be able to feed others beyond themselves. But in 1932 and 33, there was the time when the Soviet government took wheat from Ukraine to bring to other parts of the Soviet Union because the harvest hadn't gone well. And about 5 million Ukrainians died. So this was a conscious decision on Stalin's government to do this. So the Holodomor is what's known as. It's very much in the minds of a lot of Ukrainians. And so this is a picture that my friend Jesper took just a couple weeks ago. This is the first snow in Kyiv recently. And this young girl, who was a symbol of how so many people died from starvation. She's emaciated. Someone had placed, again, some wheat stalks on her statue. I walked by this many, many times. It's very, very, very gripping. But you can see that this idea is very much in the forefront of a lot of Ukrainians thinking, particularly with the war going on right now. But even prior to that, there is this distinct awareness of that. And here you can see, this is just a random picture I took, but I saw wheat everywhere. This was on a bike ride in the countryside one day. This is, I think both of these are millstones from the memorial, and there's many of them there to kind of commemorate how the wheat was taken. And then you can see what I think is an amazing thing, the flag of Ukraine, which a lot of Ukrainians are very, very proud of. You know, it doesn't symbolize blood or wars. It symbolizes the bright blue sky and fields of wheat. And I think it's a glorious thing. And so I found, like, digging into this, that it just keeps coming through in all these different ways. So I felt like I had to include it. So I won't go down that rabbit hole anymore. So Christmas Eve is really what it's all about. And I found that Christmas Eve, New Year's Eve in Ukraine, it's huge. And people love to stay up late and eat and drink and just be together. And it's really a wonderful thing. This is a woodcut by Jacques Nidovsky. And he's a really interesting artist. He actually, his family's, in the 19 teens, his parents were taken and exiled to Siberia. He made his way by himself into Europe. World War I started, he was captured, then he made his way to New York and he became an artist there. And in his depiction here, I thought of the Christmas Eve meal is really beautiful. As you can see, there's 12 dishes, and these 12 dishes, they symbolize the 12 apostles. I kind of thought it'd be the Christmas, but it's everywhere I read, and I was told, no, it's the 12 apostles. So that's what it is. No meat or dairy. So all day people would fast. And I was really impressed by this, but then they just get down to business when it's time to eat. So it makes it worthwhile. What I love here in this picture is you can see the grandmother and grandfather from the video that we saw. They're taking the straw and it's put on the table. So before the table is set, the straw put out, again, to symbolize the manger where Jesus was born, to symbolize the ancestors. Also, some is taken and it's kind of put along underneath the table, and some peanuts and candy would be thrown in there so the kids would have something to do like later on. So it has all these different functions, but again, you can see it's another wheat product, you know, and it's really interesting. So the meal starts when the first star is seen. And as you saw in the video, the kids were really waiting for that. When it starts, I'll show you some of the dishes that are eaten, but there's garlic is there. So garlic's good luck, keeps away the bad spirits. It's at the four corners of the table. And grandfather will start, and he'll take the kutia here, which is on the upper left, which is buckwheat, honey, and sometimes buckwheat, always wheat, and increasingly dried fruit and nuts. But that's what he flung at the ceiling. And so the idea is that the poppy seeds that stick, that's how many there will be a symbol of the abundance for next year. That was really interesting. I'm not sure how many people actually do that anymore. But poppy seeds are in everything for Christmas, which I thought is really interesting. And this really surprised me too. Living there, I would bring home pastries thinking that it would be chocolate or really super sweet, and it wasn't. It's a very like earthy kind of nutty taste, and very, very common. And again, poppy seeds are a symbol of prosperity and abundance. And so you'll see them infused in everything. And so these vareniki, if you're familiar with pierogi, very similar. A lot of times they'll have like farmer's cheese, kapusta, sauerkraut, mushrooms, meat. But on Christmas Eve in particular, we'll have poppy seeds. And a whole array of dishes. Cabbage rolls, the golubtsi, almost always. Borscht, which Ukrainians would tell you is from Ukraine. There's some debate about this between Ukraine and Russia, but there's a town called Borscht in Western Ukraine, so I think they can claim that. Mushroom soup. Mushrooms are canned. Tomatoes are canned or pickled. There's so many vegetables that people will put as pickles and then in winter pull out and eat and feast on, which I thought was really amazing. I had never had a pickled tomato before, and they're delicious. And then, of course, on the left, there's kapusta, and there's the sauerkraut, which can be kept, all winter fermenting away with wild mushrooms. And these are very common dishes all the time in Ukraine, but especially you can see how the table would be presented. And this is no exaggeration, like I've been to several Ukrainian get-togethers, and this is how it always looks. and they just take out all the stops. But it's really, a lot of it's very simple food. You can see there's different forms of pickles. There's some of those pickled tomatoes I was talking about. Cheese, in this case, that might be cheese or meat. This may or may not be Christmas Eve. But there's a whole array of fruits and vegetables, and they're all really simple, but just really good food. The uzvar, you'll see that in the container in the center at right. This is a really unusual. It surprised a lot of my colleagues who weren't from Ukraine when on our first week in Ukraine, we went to a banquet and we drank this, what looked like some type of juice, and it tasted smoky. And it's made from reconstituted, dehydrated or smoked fruit. So there'll be oftentimes apples, dried cherries, but also smoked plums, and they give it this really distinctive taste. And some people are just repulsed by it. I thought it was really interesting. I loved it. So, but this is also something that is a way, especially if you think there's no refrigeration back in the old times, it's a way to have this like taste of summer. And so you can still buy the makings for uzvar. You can just buy it in bulk like that and bring it home, put boiling water over it, let it sit all day, and then you drink it. It's delicious. And again, for dessert, you'd have pampushki that are sweetened and with a little bit of prune jam or poppy seed. So, as I said, part of the pagan part of this is to get out and enjoy the darkness. And so on St. Nicholas Day, which in the Orthodox calendar is the 19th, is when the Christmas tree, the big Christmas tree gets lit in all the main town squares. And this is in Kyiv. And this was right before I came back for Christmas in 2021. So there's fireworks, they light the tree. You can see St. Sophia's Cathedral in the back. St. Sophia's is 1,000 years old. So it's this really amazing space where there's a very modern, they have pop singers come out and sing, but then you see this, evidence of the history of this place. It's really quite amazing. And there are 3 or 4 areas in the city, like big town square type plazas, that get turned into these like winter playgrounds. And so there'll be places for food and drink. There'll be sledding. So they'll set up little sledding hills, little skating rinks, more like pathways. You can rent skates, and they become so popular. They just get so packed with people. It's really funny. And then here you can see St. Nicholas or Did Moroz. It's the old version of St. Nick, makes a visit. And again, this is in front of St. Sophia's. Every year, the decorations and ornamentations change. There's a different theme, and it really brings people out. A newer tradition, this is a street in Podil. This is a district in Old, and the work of Maria Primachenko has been out in the past few years. A lot of these huge versions of her animals. So she is into this kind of mystical realism, and she was a self-taught artist that Picasso, he actually fell in love with her artwork in the 30s and 40s. But a lot of her art is brought out. You see a lot of examples of embroidery. There are a lot of crafts vendors that come out. And this is Maria Primachenko here. And so Christmas is very much a celebration of Ukrainian culture as much as it is a celebration of Jesus's birth. And then caroling, this is caroling that took place during an air raid siren this past Christmas. And there are all kinds of scenes that have come from the underground. This is the the metro stop for Zoloty Vrata, which is the golden dome, the old golden gate from the old city. And it's a very popular subway station. I used to use it a lot. And these folks were stuck down there, so they just decided to strike up a song. And as I said, I had young kids would come to my apartment door, and they were just looking for some treats, maybe a little bit of money, and they would sing you a couple songs. And it's really a very, very common practice, and it's lovely to see. I think it's something that we only think existed, long ago here, but it's still quite common. One song, which I won't play, but you all know, the song Carol of the Bells, that actually has Ukrainian roots. This song, which was known as Shedrik. So the pronunciation SHCH is like a sh. So Shedrik is about the idea that there's bounty to the season. This little bird, the sparrow, comes, and it's basically reminding us that we have all that we need. And we have and will have. It's a really beautiful message. And the song was written in 1916. It came to New York in 1922, and that's when the English version was written, and it gained popularity in the United States. So a little side note there that affects us. And then the Epiphany is how the season ends. And like I said, the season just stretches on. The markets stay up. All of these winter activities stay up. And then on the 19th of January, which is the Orthodox Epiphany, lots of people go jump in the river. and there are people will set up a banya, which is like a Russian version of a sauna with steam, and they'll head out and they'll jump in the Dnipro, or they'll jump into a lake. And in the woods by my apartment, there was this pool of water, this spring-fed pool that was made by a monk. I think 100 years ago. I remember reading the story on, this is my dog walking by it, but people all throughout the winter will go and take a dip as a way to just rejuvenate, replenish, and obviously this harkens back to the baptism of Jesus. And for the Epiphany, for Catholics, obviously it's a little bit different with the presentation of the Magi, but this idea, I think, of baptism and rebirth, for me, it was really powerful, because you can see how making it through this long winter, you feel like, okay, I'm going to do this, make it into the new year. And it's really a wonderful thing. So people will take work off and head down to the river. So winter is one full festival season in Ukraine. So just to wrap up and give you a little bit more of the political and legal bits and pieces here. So typically Ukrainians are more Catholic in the West and Orthodox in the East, as I said. Historically, they had different calendars. So Catholics would celebrate Christmas on the 25th, Orthodox followers on the 7th. During the Soviet period, all religious celebrations were discouraged under the official state policy of atheism. The Bolsheviks argued that Christmas was a pagan, sun-worshiping ritual with no basis in scientific fact, and denounced the Christmas tree as a bourgeois German import. So that's a quote from a historian. And that kind of sums up a lot of how Christmas was affected by the Soviets. So in the 20s and 30s, a lot of traditions that were part of Ukrainian Christmas actually just moved over to New Year's. And the Soviet government tolerated that because they thought, okay, we need to give the workers a break. And so a lot of what you just saw, particularly with the meal, that happens on New Year's. Like I would have friends who don't start their New Year's until 9 or 10 o'clock. They have a meal with their family. They see in the new year at midnight, and then everyone goes out to celebrate. And they'll oftentimes go out into the neighborhood. They'll go out to a local square. They might bring a bottle of champagne and just mingle with their neighbors. It's a really wonderful thing. And really, so many people spend the entire night outside. So what recently is even more interesting. Upon independence from the Soviet Union, January 7th became official Christmas. And then in 2017, just before I arrived, the 25th became also an additional legal Christmas. So there were two official holidays for Christmas. During the same time, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was working on splitting away from the Russian Orthodox Patriarchy. And they were working with other Ukrainian churches to see if they could come upon some form of agreement. So just this past year, there was this process that went through the churches and finally was signed by President Zelensky, and it permanently changed Christmas to only December 25th. So this is brand new this year. And it's fascinating to see. I think as Americans, it's kind of hard to imagine, like, how could you just keep changing this? But for them, politically, it just makes a lot of sense in terms of their relationship with Russia and the history of the holiday. But because Ukrainians are who they are, 45% of them, only 45 said they'll celebrate on the 25th. 17% will celebrate on the 7th. But a few more than that are actually going to spend more on their New Year's preparations. So you can see in terms of the amount of money that people spend, the gifts that they give for each other, it really doesn't have the same significance as Christmas here, but it has a very big cultural significance. And so folks, even who aren't seriously religious, will go to some of these historic cathedrals, light candles, and they'll make the rounds throughout town. So I think it's a really interesting contrast with our own celebrations. If we have time, I asked some of my friends to describe the place, and they sent me some messages. We went back and forth on Telegram and WhatsApp. So this is my friend Yura, who grew up in Kyiv. He's about my age, probably he's a little younger, maybe early 40s. He said, my family never celebrated Christmas, and all winter holiday celebrations and traditions were of a Soviet style, with famous Soviet movies on the TV and mayonnaise salads on the table. Nowadays, Ukraine has grown a distance with those traditions, which is more than understandable. It really feels wrong to stick to them. On the other hand, if you don't come from a religious family that kept the old Ukrainian traditions for decades, which is rare because of the Russian-Soviet genocides, such families were meant to go extinct, it would be weird to start celebrating something that you feel no connection to. So we just don't celebrate it.
Interesting.
His wife, Natasha, who's from Poltava. Poltava is a city east of Kyiv, a little bit smaller. She said, my family is not religious, but we used to celebrate Christmas like any other holiday by gathering around a big table full of tasty food. I think my family used it as another reason to gather family together for a feast, which really is what most holidays are for, right? Santa used to drop some presents under the Christmas tree for me that night, just like at New Year's Eve. So interesting to see that they celebrate that same thing on New Year's. Otherwise, there was nothing special about the celebration with my family, but it seemed to be a bit weird to stick to the old calendar just for this day. At least the country has got rid of that calendar now. Back in the 90s, when I was a kid, a friend of mine invited me to join her caroling when we knocked at our neighbors' doors, read some Christmas poems, and got some candies and money in return. Easy money. It's a shame it wasn't about the old Ukrainian traditions, which are bright and meaningful for us. There was no connection to the roots whatsoever. I blame the Soviets for that. They worked hard to erase our national identity, our traditions, language, etc. Christianity, paganism, atheism, communism got messed up. Our grandparents, raised by Soviet ideology, were, quote, communists and atheists, but they still celebrated Christmas and Easter. How much sense does that make? And lastly, this is my friend Oksana, who was she ran the Ukrainian program at the international school where I taught. She was also had her law degree. She's an amazing person, and also taught a class on Ukrainian culture and language that I took. She says that Ukrainians love winter holidays. The cycle of the December through January holidays in Ukraine got its comic name, Ukrainian Ramadan, for this reason. There are so many holidays and reasons to celebrate. St. Andrew's, St. Nicholas, St. Vasil, Christmas, Old and New Style New Year. Oh, that's right. There's an Old New Year's as well. Malanka and more. Families gather to join in a traditional supper and sometimes even leave an empty place setting to represent loved ones who have passed on. Other traditions include placing a small handful of hay on the table to represent Jesus in the manger. Well, Ukrainians have always loved and have known how to celebrate. There is a good reason behind this, actually. Ukrainian ancestors were all farmers. They were working really hard in their fields all spring, summer, and autumn, and used wintertime to really enjoy themselves. And I think this really is the essence of the winter holidays in Ukraine. And the other is just to really get out, see your neighbor. You've been cooped up, for months already. And this is a picture of my two oldest sons and the older couple that they met. This is at some point on New Year's, maybe it's 2 a.m. I don't remember. They came home. I came home, I think, at 3, and all of my neighbors were outside. They had a table set. And they greeted me as I came home. And then I think my sons got back at 5 or 6, hung out with them until the sun came up, and then showed me all these pictures of people that they met. And it's really wonderful because people will bring a bottle of champagne into the square. This is right downtown. This is actually in front of St. Sophia's, the beautiful cathedral that you saw earlier. And people just hang out and talk with each other. It's really wonderful. And it's a symbol of, the connections I think that people still try to maintain during this time. So that's winter, Christmas in Ukraine. Thank you. What questions do you have? Please.
Still standing or
Yes.
damaged at all?
It is. So the St. Sophia's, which I'm trying to think the best view I have of it here. Well, you can actually see, this is what they still look like. So St. Michael's had some damage. St. Michael's actually was rebuilt because it was leveled during World War II. So some of these cathedrals have actually been rebuilt over the years. St. Michael's is where they rang the bells when the Mongols invaded in like the 1200s. So it's just this really deep history, but they all are mostly still standing. I thought about including a picture. I don't have it here, but many of the monuments have been sandbagged. And so they're basically just covered in sandbags right now. But St. Sophia's has not been touched. Santa and gift giving. So there is some of it, but it is not on the level that it is here. And I think well, it's true. You will see Santa, and there are representations. So there's a lot. The German candy is very popular. There's Kinder, and so there you'll see it, and you'll see Santa characters out and about, but it does not have the same. Santa does not have the same like centrality that it does in our own stories and in traditions. Gifts are given, but it's not as much as spent. I think some of that is because of just the economic situations that people are in. I think the last I knew, the average salary in Kyiv was $6,000 a year. So out in the countryside, it would be even less. However, from what I saw, I took some trips out into the countryside, and people in the villages have a bounty of food, and people raise bees. There's honey. They have vegetables that they put up for winter. So it really is much more about being together, celebrating. And I would say like the meal itself, bringing food to people is more important than the commercial aspect of it. But there's still some of that. Yeah, thank you. Other questions?
What was the reason for being in Ukraine? Were you with a program of some sort?
Yeah, so I was had been teaching in Lansing for years, and I also had a side business, and then I just with my family decided to look abroad to teach, and basically I looked for the school that was best for me and my two younger sons who would be still in school. So there was an international school called Pacher School International, and it's right in the city. And it is a school of about was a school of about 40 different countries represented. So 30% Ukrainian, American, British. And so it's a school where there are a lot of diplomats' kids, executives from multinational corporations, that they want their children to have an English language education. So I was there to teach economics and business management. It's a private school. And yeah, it was a great place to be. Really interesting to see the kinds of people that were there. So the economy really was growing quite a bit before the war. So there was a lot of investment, folks from the World Bank, IMF. So it was a private international school. And it looked like to be, for what I could see, a very international population. I thought that would be good for my sons. Yes, sir.
Yeah, the generational piece is very interesting to me in that you're talking about different eras in the
Yes.
history, and some of them from the Russian occupational period, but you had people who came before that. And how does all this interact with each other in these generational pieces? How do they view each other? How do they, is there an interactiveness with it, or what's the story on that?
That's a great question. I think it depends. I think it really depends. I think in rural areas, I would say you'd see more continuity between the generations in terms of some of these traditions. But it really depends on the part of the country that you're from. And then if you grew up in a big city, you would have gone to school up until 1991 learning Russian. You would not have learned Ukrainian history. So a lot of that knowledge was missing. So folks that were born, let's say, prior to World War II, really were the ones that kind of were the keepers of some of that knowledge, and some of that filtered down. But I could see it even in some of my friends where they just didn't have that same. It really depends. It really depends on where you were. I had friends that spoke Russian, friends that spoke Ukrainian, much more from the West and also from the Carpathian Mountains. And that's an area where a lot of Ukrainians go to experience, let's say, like real Ukraine. So a lot of these traditions did get carried on there. And there are a lot of like villages that people go back to vacation and kind of experience that. So it's interesting. It's really mixed. It's very mixed. And it depends on where you would have gone to school, what part of the country that you lived and grew up in. But there is, and there has been since independence from the Soviet Union, and then increasingly a big resurgence in Ukrainian history and culture. And so you see it like popularized. And I think that's what kind of struck me about a lot of these celebrations is that, a lot of what you see. And so there is a gap there, though. I think there really is a historical gap.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Over the years that you were there, and I'm sorry, I didn't,
About 4 years.
did you see were you tuned into people's attitudes toward the United States, and did they fluctuate while you were there? Did you see any trends?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say across the board, very positive. And so this would have been 2018 that I first went. And so that would have been during the Trump presidency. So some questions about like, okay, tell me more about this. But in general, I would say a lot of appreciation and respect. A lot of Ukrainians have family who have either traveled or who have lived in the US or Canada. And I think that's because there's about 40 million Ukrainians, but a lot of them, there are millions that have gone abroad over the past 150 years. So in general, there's a lot of understanding of American culture and history. And I mean, people would strike up conversations with me and ask me about politics or, oh, Michigan, tell me more about like, they would know Detroit and, automobiles. So I think there's a general interest in respect and high regard. And so I went back in May of 22 after the war started, go to my apartment. This is after the Russians had left Kyiv. And so I took a train in with some friends, and a lot of Ukrainians were going back at that point. And people were amazingly appreciative that I was there. Like it was, like these are people who are living there. And I just took a train in for a few days and left. And, people were like, oh, we're so glad you're here. You're so brave. I'm like, well, you're living in a war zone. But people were very appreciative of the connection. And I think with the appreciation of the attention of the international community, and obviously the U.S. has given a lot of support. So during that time, and depending on who you talk to in America, right, it's mixed, but in general, really, I think very supportive and positive impression. Yeah. I know I was really well received wherever I went, and I took bike trips through little villages, and people were always very receptive.
Can you talk about how your family over there has been affected by the war?
Well, I have friends, family anymore. But the 3 quotes that I read to you, 2 are still in Kyiv. I have a number of friends who are still living in Kyiv. And then the last quote from my friend Oksana, she left with her children, and she's working at a school in Hungary. And so a lot of folks with young children left. If they had, like, let's say a son maybe who's in their teens, the idea of them going into the military is there. So I have friends who left. Men couldn't leave. So the couples that I know that are together, the women have stayed. So like Natasha and Yura and my friends Dima and Masha, and they are working. They work in IT, so they're able to keep a job. But when I wake up and read the news about like drone strikes or something, we'll reach out, or there'll be a text conversation going on, and they'll have not slept, and they might have had their power out. Last winter was hard. They went several days at a time without any power, and it was getting very cold in their apartment. So it's really up and down. And there in Kyiv, there isn't danger of fighting on the ground, but there are missile attacks and drone strikes just sort of intermittently. They'll go weeks without anything, and then all of a sudden over a period of days, it'll be kind of nonstop. So it's really, really up and down. And when I was there, it was really odd, because it was it was a month after the Russian soldiers had actually been in the city and they had been pushed out. And when I was there, it seemed like another May in Kyiv. So the people are very resilient, but I think it's hard on a daily basis. Yeah. And then if you have a family member or friend who's in the military, which almost everybody does there, I think it has a really a big personal impact.
I'm just
Yes.
curious, contact with the Ukrainian community that's in your city and the.
So I haven't yet. I have been connected twice, and I'm new. So my wife Michelle and I have moved up recently, and this is my first year at Interlochen, and we'll be building a house around the corner on Burr Street next year, hopefully. But I have been connected twice, and so I would love to, but I haven't. Nothing has come of it, so I would love to. If there's any way to help, I would love to. Yes, and so I've heard. I think Matt, you passed along some info, and a friend Aubrey in Frankfurt, who's on the school board, also mentioned it. So feel free to throw my name out there. Yes, sir. Servant of the people. Yes, that Zelensky starred in. So he asked about Servant of the People, which was a series that Zelensky starred in, and he's a history teacher who gets somehow elected to be president, and then lo and behold, a year or two later, he actually becomes president. It's goofy. I think what I appreciated about it is that you get to see the city, and it really shows like what Kyiv is like, and there's some of the Ukrainian humor. When it's interesting that you asked this, because people that I knew thought he was a clown. They just, even when he was president, they just thought, this guy's a joke. And then once the war happened, they thought very differently about him. I think he really showed that he's not just a joker, right? But yeah, everyone had the impression that he was just kind of this goofball, and this guy is going to be a one and done president. And I think it's turned out to be not the case at all. But I would recommend, just for a little snippet of life in Kyiv, to watch that. I think I watched 3 or 4 episodes, and that was enough.
Since the war's been going on, can you tell us a little bit about what's happened with schools? I don't mean your school, but just in general, public schools,
Yeah. That's
Good.
great. It's a mix, again, depending on where you live. So my school went online when the war started. And then last year, the school year, they had a satellite campus in Warsaw. American School of Warsaw hosted a much smaller student body. We went from like 570 kids to like 90. but a lot of the families, especially Ukrainian families, want to keep the organization alive. They actually moved back this fall. And so the school is back open. A couple of my friends who work there have been teaching. They have had drills to go into the basement when the air raid sirens go off. A lot of schools have gone underground. There were schools in the subway, like I showed this picture of the Caroline. A lot of things happened down in the subway. The subways were actually built to be partly bomb shelters for nuclear war. I mean, when you go down, you'll see there's massive blast doors and there's a lot of room. And so a lot of things happen underground. And education, particularly the math and sciences and arts, is huge in Ukraine. So they're keeping it going any way they can. So they're still functioning. Some days they might have to go in the basement, or they might have to not have class, and probably some level of being hybrid online or not. And then you have a situation in the east and south where there are hundreds of thousands of refugees. So if I can get the map quick. Oops, sorry. So here there's lots of folks that have left, and I think about 1 million have gone to Poland and have been resettled temporarily, or who knows, for a longer period of time. So it really depends on where you're from. But along the line here in the east and the south, there's just not a lot of people living there anymore. It's like trench warfare. So it's artillery, tanks, trenches. And a friend of mine was a lawyer. He enlisted, and he's an officer, and he had like his story on Facebook was like artillery shells flying overhead, in a trench. And so it's a really, really difficult existence, but they really believe in Ukraine, they believe in the independence of their country. So there are a lot of people who are willing to continue to fight. And still have Christmas and New Year's. I saw that the lights were going up, and the 19th will come soon. So they'll be lighting the tree again. I think last year they actually didn't light the tree. Some of it was just for safety reasons, not to make a target out of it. But I saw that there still were going to be some public gatherings and celebrations.
All right, any other questions? All right, well, let's give Matt a round of applause, please.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me.